Good evening, and welcome to the midweek service of Calvary Baptist Church. I'm Pastor Tim Smith. Glad to have you with us, and especially glad in this holiday season to remember the advent of Christ and to look forward to a new year. I trust that it's already been a good experience for you, and you are expecting great things from 2021 as we look forward to welcoming in the new year in just a day or so. On Wednesday nights, we've been studying the book of James, and I invite you as we continue our study this evening to look at James chapter 1 and verses 26 and 27. That's the text that we'll be examining this evening. James chapter 1. We're right at the end of the first chapter, the opening chapter that has introduced us to the subject of trials that are testings meant to improve our patience, our endurance, our character, but also occasions to test our peacefulness and especially our treatment of others, that when things are hard, perhaps it becomes even more difficult to respond well to others. And so one of James's interests is that while the people that he is pastoring, shepherding over, are going through trials, he doesn't want them to, of course, not to fall away, but he also wants to challenge them to love one another, to be kind to one another, to show Christian graces even in the midst when things are under pressure, that one does not turn against others in blame or accusation or just in frustration, but to show genuine love. So we've seen that emphasis upon how one speaks, and especially controlling one's anger has been one of the themes we've looked at in recent weeks. The text that we look at this evening is also a text that relates to how we speak to and how we think about others. So look with me at James chapter 1 and verse number 26. If anyone among you thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless. Pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows, in their trouble, and to keep oneself unspotted by the world. James is challenging us with true religion. James has a lot of Hebrew expressions and Hebrew themes, Jewish themes based in Jewish Old Testament scriptures. This is a text that particularly reminds me of several Old Testament texts. For example, Isaiah chapter 1, verses 16 and 17 come to mind as I was reading this text, which tell us to wash yourselves, that idea of keep oneself unspotted by the world, echoed here in wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, put away the evil of your doings from before my eyes, cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, rebuke the oppressor, defend the fatherless, plead for the widow. So while in reverse order, those verses basically have the same exhortation that James 1 has. Also, one of the key just kind of exhortations of the Old Testament in terms of what the Lord desires of us, Micah chapter 6, verse 8, He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. These basic requirements of what God expects of His people, what God requires of His people in a nutshell, and in summary form, these are the kind of things God looks for. So James is exhorting his people, and by extension us, that we might have a right expression of God's requirements of us as we live our lives. So the idea of true religion. What is true religion? The expression that James uses, this is true religion is this, suggests that there are false presentations of religion, either a wrong doctrine that is expressed religiously, or perhaps a right doctrine that is insincerely or hypocritically lived. So what is true religion? I could break this text down into four different points or four different categories. The first is that true religion is careful how it thinks. Notice James's challenge: if anyone among you thinks he is religious. So James is dealing with our self-reflectiveness. how we think about our own spiritual lives, how we think about our commitment to God, how we perhaps defend ourselves or challenge ourselves, so that inner thoughts. And James is challenging us to think rightly. Be careful how you think about religion. And true religion is careful how it thinks. There is an expression that we've been hearing over the last 20, 30 years or so, maybe longer, at least that's how long I've been confronted with it. It says Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship. I think I appreciate the sentiment that is intended in this particular phrase. I think it means good things in what it's trying to say. There's certain things it's trying to rebuke or to challenge that are probably appropriate, but the phrase itself is clearly false, is that Christianity is a religion. But let's accept the challenge for as it is. It's not, it needs a certain perspective on religion. It needs a certain working out of religion. And a good challenge is relationship. And there are some things I appreciate about that particular challenge, that Christianity is a relationship. There are thoughts about a relationship that I think are very helpful to understand Christianity. Jesus does present himself to us personally, and he requires a personal response, where I think perhaps for some it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that religion is, it's related to church or certain sets of activities of things you do, that it is a checklist perhaps of things that you mark off saying I did this and I did this. And if that's what we think Christianity is, we need to hear it's a relationship. It's a interaction of people, us and Jesus, us and God personally. And Jesus brings us to a personal relationship with God that affects our mind, our emotions, our will, our mornings, our afternoons, our evenings, our worries, our anxieties, our triumphs, our despairs. That the relationship kind of deals in those categories that God aspires to have a relationship with us. And perhaps maybe there's a sense that if we think of religion in certain ways, we might be too easily prone to be Pharisaical. And the Pharisees were particularly known for judging themselves by the way they thought they appeared to others. And I think that's always a real challenge that we have in our lives, to evaluate ourselves by the way we think other people think about us. It's kind of mixed up, isn't it? But I think it's true, is that we have a tendency to judge ourselves by how we think other people judge us. And the strange thing is that we are frequently wrong about how they judge us, but we still do it. But even if we were right about how people thought about us, that's not the biblical standard about how we should judge ourselves. And so religion perhaps is vulnerable to living by appearances. If we look the right way when we walk into church or sing or pray, if we sound right when we pray, and other people hear us and we think, oh, they must think I'm a good Christian, that would be a false view of Christianity. Christianity is a personal relationship where God interacts with us personally, and he's not always impressed by how we appear to others. Sometimes we think we appear better than what God thinks we are, and sometimes we think we appear worse. So that's not the right category. So I appreciate the challenge to think of Christianity as a relationship where we deal with God personally and individually. We also could think of religion perhaps in very legalistic terms. Religion means to bind, and we might think of that binding in terms of a set of laws and rules that we constantly try to measure up to, and we either set the standard low enough that we happen to meet it, or we set it's so high that we just get frustrated we can never meet it. Either way, that legalistic view is something that we could use a good challenge, that Christianity is a relationship that we are birthed into or adopted by the Spirit into the family of God, and that's not best thought of as a legal transaction as it is a relational transaction that happens. So finally, I think that a good challenge for the idea of Christianity as a relationship is that it's bathed in grace. Again, the parent-child, the family relationship depends a lot upon grace and not merely legal categories. So Christianity is rooted in God's favor towards us, expressed not upon our merit, our living up to God's standards, but rather receiving God's forgiveness and God's grace and God's empowerment, and living by grace and not by the works of the law. Having said that, we must insist that Christianity is a religion, and we ought not to overlook that, and we need not look any further than past James chapter 1. That tells us that true religion is this, and clearly he is praising it. Clearly he is admonishing us to live in true religion. And so there is an importance to saying that Christianity is a relationship, but it is a relationship that is religious. Why is that important? Why is that an important theme for us to remember? As I mentioned, a religion is something that literally means to bind. And I expect it's important for us to say that at this time, especially in our history, because our contemporary world doesn't want to be bound by anything. It doesn't like law. It doesn't like rule. It's very self-driven. And that would be a very poor understanding of Christianity if we thought that we were rebuking obligation, if we were rebuking binding features. Jesus himself told us that his yoke is easy, which is a word of binding. To yoke together is to bind. It's a religious expression. To yoke ourselves to Christ is a binding, and so in that sense it is religion. We also need to remember that relationship, as good of a category it is, we can think very self-centeredly about relationships, and over the last generations we have thought very selfishly about relationships, that we like relationships on our terms. And we might begin to think Christianity is that we think of God in very self-centered terms. I will worship God as long as he meets my terms, as long as he meets my expectations, then we have this relationship. Well, Christianity never gives up a high view, an exalted view of God. And Christianity never demeans God's holiness or his majesty or his sovereignty, his kingship over all, or his worthy to be revered. And so we might think relationship might produce a too casual a view of God, where he perhaps is a buddy, or he is, maybe on the same plane as us. Certainly we have a relationship with God, but it's a relationship that is bound by religious kind of categories. God is still sovereign and majestic and holy, and God still has expectations for us. And so while he ministers to us through grace, he doesn't lower his expectations. He doesn't diminish his own worthiness of respect and honor. And so perhaps we need to remember there is a religious aspect to Christianity that we ought to keep in mind. And so we should be a little nervous about promoting too much that Christianity is not a religion, especially to a generation that doesn't like to be bound to things, that doesn't want to keep promises, that doesn't want to be inconvenienced, that wants everything like a cat does. Like, in fact, I have 2 cats that are like this, that want affection on their terms. And we would be misunderstanding Christianity if we think a relationship means that God doesn't have expectations of us. This text lists several expectations that we need to look at. But it begins with to be careful about how you think about your religion. Are you careful about how you think about your religion? James is worried, and this is not the first time, he's several times now challenged us to not be deceived, to not be fooled. Don't allow your religious life to be tricked by having it, and James is very concerned about this, to be a profession that you make with your mouth and don't live with your life. Those 2 things ought to be firmly connected together. And so James wants to challenge this. True religion doesn't just think of itself. It produces certain fruit and certain results. So Jesus didn't necessarily fault the Pharisees for being too religious, but to being hypocritically religious, to being pretentiously religious, to look like they were religious, but they really lacked the power and the obligations that God was really looking for. So number one, true religion is careful how it thinks. We ought to be careful also. Notice that the second thing that we see about true religion is that it's careful with how it speaks. It's careful about its tongue. If anyone among you thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless. Not the first time, and won't be the last time, that James challenges us to be careful with our speech. The wisdom literature of the Old Testament, particularly the book of Proverbs, is constantly challenging us to examine our speech. The wise person, and James has a lot of similarity to wisdom literature, and it also echoes this theme of evaluating your spiritual life by your speech. And here, not the public speech, not only public speech, but all of your speech. True religion guards and controls its speech, and false religion speaks carelessly, does not bridle, does not guard its speech. Kind of interesting, James loves these metaphors, and he kind of hints at a metaphor coming up in chapter 3. He's going to compare the tongue to bridling a horse. And that imagery shows up a little bit here of bridling the tongue, of having something in your mouth that controls what comes out of your mouth, bridling the tongue. So a foolish person speaks whatever he feels or whatever she feels. A foolish person has no kind of filter, no kind of pre-thought or pre-evaluation. Their best evaluation happens after the damage is done, and someone points it out. True religion guards one's speech before. We have to examine our words carefully. We ought to be a people who rarely have to say, "I'm sorry I said that, I wasn't thinking." That would be a very poor thing for a Christian to have to say. Now, speech is challenging, and we all will fall at various times, but may it not be the habit of our life that we speak carelessly, or we let our words or phrases or criticisms or anger escape our lips, because once it's out, it's really impossible to totally retrieve words that have been used already. So we ought to pre-examine our words, choosing them carefully. Proverbs 10, verse 19 tells us, "In the multitude of words sin is not lacking, but he who restrains his lips is wise." That is, there's a natural tendency to sin with our lips. And Proverbs basically says, if you don't really take this seriously, you're going to sin a lot with your lips. Maybe if you guard them, and maybe if you cut down the words, not necessarily just the number of words, but the expressiveness, kind of the natural flow of, some people speak a lot more than other people. That's not necessarily right or wrong, but some people speak more thoughtfully than others. Some people speak more under control and carefulness about their words, that they don't want to do damage with the words. And that's what James is talking about here, is to be very discerning about our words. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 3 says, "For a dream comes through much activity, and a fool's voice is known by his many words. For in the multitude of dreams and many words there is also vanity." So many words, and the context of Ecclesiastes 5 is people that make religious vows, and they make some promise, and they bring God's name into it, and they think that it's going to make some difference. God is not impressed by mere speech. He wants it to be meaningful, thoughtful, purposeful speech. So to be careful with our words, to number them and examine them carefully. As I was thinking about there's a lot of things we could do with each of these categories. Each of these are probably a series of messages on their own, but here they are kind of put together, this challenge to bridle your tongue. One of the things that came to my mind that I think I see in the Bible, and I definitely see in personal experiences, is to refrain from or restrain self-justifications. Now, it's true that sometimes we need to defend ourselves, and there's times it's right and appropriate, and I probably don't know how to draw that razor line between a false kind of self-justification and a true one, except to put it out there as a thought for us. is that we need to be careful about being too quick to justify ourselves. To be too, when we are perhaps challenged by something, perhaps a family member points out a fault that we have, perhaps a friend points out something, a weakness or a sin in our life, and we tend to be fairly, self-defending kind of people. We don't like to be criticized. We don't want to appear lower, so we're fairly quick to justify ourselves and start rattling off all the justifications. Those are, I think, always occasions that we do well to pause. And when someone points out something about us, we ought to seriously consider, there could easily be a point to that, and we should consider it, because we're too prone to justify ourselves, to defend ourselves inappropriately or too much. And that's probably true in any situation. I think it's true when we're criticized that we're too easily quick to give excuses or reasons that we should be justified, but it's also true perhaps when we're praised. We might think, you're right, I did do something wonderful, although I think the natural response from what I feel and what I hear from others is that when you're praised, it's kind of humbling, right? Because when you're praised, you tend to know, I probably was not as good as what you appeared. So those kind of contexts are good times just to say, praise the Lord. Praise the Lord that it was a blessing to you, and not draw too much attention to yourself. As Jesus talked about the servants that called themselves, we are unworthy servants, it's probably a good way to think about ourselves. Our best service probably is not as good as what it should have been, and our worst service needs to be repented of. I think it's a pretty good way to think about the way that we speak and defend ourselves or promote ourselves. As unworthy servants is a pretty good category for us. Another category that came to mind about the tendency of speaking that can really irritate the Lord and irritate others is murmuring and complaining. I kind of wish that the fourth book of the Bible was called Murmurings. We studied Numbers earlier in 2020. Numbers, of course, there's some numbering, there's some census in the book of Numbers, that's why it gets its name. But if I had to summarize the book of Numbers, I would call it the book of murmurings, complainings, discontentment. And we human beings in sin have a big problem with complaining. We complain too much. We are not grateful enough. We miss blessings. We focus on the negative. We want everything to be easier, smoother. We miss God's leading because we're too much into complaining. And Numbers is one of the main themes of that book is to guard our hearts and to guard our tongues, to be careful about murmuring and complaining, that we not be of that group. Sometimes God leads us through difficult times. That's a good time to be resolute, to be peaceful, to be patient, and not be like the children of Israel who complained against Moses and Aaron and every other leader because things were not as easy as they wanted it to be. We ought to receive God's difficulties with grace, asking for His help, of course, but not giving way to the murmuring and complaining that it's not only Israel, that's human nature. One of the things that perhaps you've noticed if you've worked at a secular job and maybe even a Christian job, but I think more noticeably in a secular job is what happens at lunchtime and break time or chatting time is how much complaining goes on, how much murmuring goes on. It's really a shame to the human condition because we are really a blessed people. God has been good to us. He's not treated us according to our merits, but it's been gracious to us. That ought to show up in our speech. So guard your speech by not murmuring and complaining. We ought to speak truthfully and speak wisely. We ought to be a people committed to speaking truth. It's hard. We hear rumors. We're not sure if they're true or not. They're kind of fun. We pass them along. We see something on Facebook that looks sensational, so we copy it and paste it. We have an obligation to communicate truth. And you can't always know, but we ought to do some due diligence to make sure things that we say, things that we post, things that we claim are actually true. And that can be a very challenging calling for us. But we Christians don't want to be regularly found on people that are lying or spreading false things. Our speech ought to be measured. And if we don't know if it's true, we should be silent or admit we don't know something rather than pretend we know something, and to really try to say things that are only true, and then not just true, but say them wisely. And there's a slight difference there is to the wise person sometimes doesn't say everything that's true because it's not beneficial, or says it in a way that's most helpful. So we need to speak words that are true, but also words that are edifying and building up. So we ought to speak in those terms, lovingly, softly, patiently. A soft answer turns away wrath. We've looked at that theme a couple times in James 1 already, with a view always to edification and not just to hurt. When you get in an argument with someone, when you get in some kind of spat with somebody, the natural inclination of the human spirit in sin is to hurt the other person, is to say something that's going to, not going to help things. It's going to make them sting a little bit. Maybe you got stung. Maybe you were hurt in some respect. So the natural response is to say something that's hurtful in return. Of course, that just goes back and forth, never ending. As Christians, we ought to bridle our speech and speak lovingly, softly, with a view to advancing the conversation towards peace rather than continual conflict. And so we ought to be guarded in our speech, especially as we have opportunity to criticize, as we have opportunity to point out the faults of either the person we're speaking to or the person we're speaking about. We ought to guard our comments with helpful. There is a time for constructive criticism, but it needs to be constructive and it needs to be helpful. The third category that James addresses is that true religion is concerned for widows and orphans. Pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their trouble. So true religion is that which cares for the needy. It cares for the widows and orphans. That would be the category in biblical times, and in our times not quite the same way, but in a similar way. Those widows and orphans being people in need. And not just need, but unable to help themselves frequently. And God is looking for people that are concerned for those people in need. So we ought to be seeking, as part of our religious commitment to God, to asking, how might we be a part of helping women and children that are in need, that are without provision? Women being particularly vulnerable in the ancient world because most of the work was physically demanding work. And the advantage perhaps in our time is there's a lot more skill kind of labor that is not quite so, sexist in the terms of how much grunt work can you do. So perhaps in some respects, but women still have that place of caring for children. God blessed them with the ability to bear children and with the opportunity, and then the reality of children, and that is an economic impact to that. And men and Christians ought to be concerned about that. We ought to be concerned for those that are the most dependent and the most vulnerable. As we saw earlier, God challenged the people of Israel in Isaiah to seek justice, rebuke the oppressor, defend the fatherless, plead for the widow. So we ought also to guard those. Granted, things are complicated, but the complications in the modern world should not nullify the thought. And what I mean by complicated is that the government does a lot more for people than it would have done in biblical times. But government's a lot bigger than it ever was before. And government takes upon these things, and I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but it does make it more complicated for us to know how to think about those things. But James really can't be just written off saying, well, the government does that, so we don't have to do it. One thing I think we know after a couple hundred years of the government trying to do this, especially the last 100 years, is that the government does it very imperfectly. the government has flaws in it. And just because the government forms some agency doesn't mean that that agency is effective at doing what we want it to do. Those agencies take upon a life of their own. They take upon their own desires and their own protections. And so a lot of the money we put into it goes to whoever's working for these agencies and doesn't always go to the people. And then it doesn't go as thoughtfully and effectively because the government doesn't know. I remember quite a few years ago now, but it was a striking moment in my pastoral ministry that a needy person called me, and I used to get a lot of these calls, not as many recently, maybe I said no too many times, but I used to get a lot of calls from needy people, and I got this call from this guy, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 times, and I think I might have helped them with a gift card once. And once I do that, then I get a lot more calls. Once you help them once, they call back. And so the second and third time, I was like, nah, I really can't help you. And about the 4th time he called, I said, hey, why don't you have any family? Can't you go to, your parents, or do you have, siblings or somebody? And it must have been a weak moment because he said to me, oh, they think I'm lazy. And I was like, oh, they think you're lazy, do they? I'm like, well, that the government doesn't always know who the lazy people are, but their relatives and their friends probably do know who the lazy people are. And that's the way personal involvement's better than governmental programs, who have a very difficult time making moral judgments and figuring out, who could do more than they can do. So anyway, we ought to take some personal responsibility to help the needy, realizing, yes, the government has taken over a lot of this, and for right or wrong, it's one of the realities, but we ought not to alleviate our own sense of obligation to do what we can. A part of this category of the women and children, I believe, is properly understood as those who can't help you back, which is parallels a lot of Jesus' teaching, that Jesus is not just interested in us, giving, because sometimes you give in order to get back. And that's one of the motives to give, is if you're kind to the right people, they might be kind to you. Jesus is particularly interested in being kind to those who can't possibly repay you, at least in terms of material good. Now, they'll probably repay you in terms of grace, in terms of gratitude, in terms of respect, that's true. But in terms of social standing, in terms of financial, recompense, they probably can't. We ought to consider who can we do good to that probably can't possibly do good, something good for us in return. I believe we do need to be careful about this new category. I'm not sure if it's new in practice, but a new term, virtue signaling. In the spat between Democrats and Republicans, the cold-hearted Republicans that don't care for the poor, and the Democrats who want to give away free stuff to everybody. In all that debate, I think there is a danger to evaluate yourself by your political position. And there is a danger to think that you are righteous because you hold the right position, that you are on the right side, whatever it is. If you're pro-Democrat, you're the right side, or you're pro-Republican, you're on the right side. I really don't think God's that impressed of the fact that we pull the lever on the right side. Not when he talks about this. And sometimes people are a little too proud of taking the right stance. God wants to know who actually have you helped. Who actually have you blessed? Who actually have you ministered to? So, sure, we can argue whether we want to charge the rich 40% of their income or 70% of their income, and we can pat ourselves in the back because we're good because we take from the rich and give to the poor. I'm not so sure God's impressed with that kind of thinking. God was much more concerned with who are you kind to? Who are you reaching out to? Who are you encouraging? Who are you sharing, some material comfort? Or even if you can't do much materially, who are you serving and helping? Those are much better virtue categories than holding the right philosophical positions as if they matter a whole lot. They probably don't matter as much as we might wish they did. So we ought to watch, thinking we look virtuous because we hold the right positions, and hold ourselves rather to personal virtue. What actually are we doing that is good for others? Part of this widows and orphans, tells me that the basic position is family ought to care for family. And that's a category that needs to be always encouraged, that we might feel a need to help somebody, but perhaps the first thing we might want to think, this widow, does she have children somewhere that have money that they could help her? And those children ought to be challenged to take care of mom, or brothers and sisters caring for one another. We will need less big government if families were families and took care of each other, and if somebody was in need, they brought them in their house and provided either temporary or longer term. If we did more of that, we wouldn't have to fight so much about taxes and big government programs. Families ought to care for families, so that the category really was widows and orphans rather than everybody that might have some kind of need. We also, this expression, visit widows and orphans, is probably a term that means help them. But I did pause when I was reading it this afternoon to think it probably means visit them too. It probably means personal presence. And there's something powerful about personal presence that money is not a substitute for. That giving of ourselves, of our smiles or our cries, our arm around the shoulder, just being with somebody going through a difficult time, we ought to remember that. I frequently mention that every year I watch or read, at least on a couple of occasions during the holiday season, Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And of course, Ebenezer Scrooge is the dominant, he's kind of the main figure, but there are two kind of heroic figures in that story that are contrast to Ebenezer Scrooge, at least before his change. And those are Bob Cratchit and Ebenezer Scrooge's nephew, Fred Halliwell. And those two figures are poor, but they're heroic, because goodness is not just a matter of money, it's a matter of personal presence. And Charles Dickens does a masterful job in that story of depicting Bob Cratchit and Fred as personal. They are with their families. They are inviting friends. They're expressing genuine feelings of goodwill. And more than Ebenezer Scrooge's money, they need that. He needs their attitude. And I'm always challenged by those figures of that blessing of the personal presence, the blessing of well-meant and well-stated condolences and encouragements and face-to-face communication. Fred just keeps asking his Uncle Ebenezer to dinner just because he wants to meet him personally. I think that's what God wants us here, not just to give widows and orphans money, but to give them of our faces, of our good words, of our personal interaction with them, that personal presence, that is only in shadow is represented by what we do on Facebook. There's too much distance there. There's too much impersonality. There's too much, too much vagueness. That personal presence, visiting those in need. Of course, that's a challenge in the COVID crisis, right, where we are forbidden by the governor to visit those in distress. Hopefully we're over this, because there's something anti-Christian about our response to COVID, that we can't smile, we can't grieve, we can't hug. We need to get over this, because Christianity is a personal religion where people are interacting face to face and sharing each other's burdens at some close distance. Finally, James encourages us to be unspotted by the world. True religion is that which remains or keeping oneself unspotted from the world. A little earlier in James 1, James had warned us about the overflow or the abundance of wickedness. and I think he meant the same thing here, is that we live in a world that's filthy. It's morally filthy. And true religion knows that it lives in this world where there's an abundance of evil, abundance of traps. And true Christianity, true religion, seeks to somehow manage to get through this world without being seduced into this realm of wickedness and this realm of fulfilling sinful desires. So true religion walks through life seeking to not be contaminated and pushed over into the ways of the world with all of its self-will and selfish desires. So James focuses on these desires. He tells us that sin and death come from the desires that we want things. And I think he means the same thing here. It's this root of worldliness. In James 4, he's going to say that's where wars and conflicts come. They come from these sinful desires of the heart. And so we need to keep ourselves from those wrong desires, knowing that they originate from within. We don't really need sin to seek us. There's something in us that seeks it. However, there is a sense in which there are occasions that want to draw out these desires. And it seems to me a good Christian philosophy of life looks at both those things. The majority of our effort needs to be challenging our desires, because you can't control all the world around you. You might determine to be, not look at a woman lustfully, and you might be very cautious in your life, but you're going to drive by billboards, there's going to be TVs on in the place you work or the friends you visit, there's going to be women that dress sensually near you, and you can't always stop that. So there needs to be a healthy dose that you need to get it at the source. But then again, not being foolish and opening yourselves up to occasions of temptation, whatever those temptations are, whether it's your past might have been drugs and alcohol, to know there's certain people you can't go around, and there's certain places you can't go, and certain things you should keep yourself from. So that kind of two-headed, guarding your desires and guarding the occasions that might stimulate those desires, to be aware there's just going to be some temptations you're going to be better off not opening yourself up to. And so we can do this by remembering Christ as our standard. The world's not a good measure because their standards are all over the place and sinking. The world can't be our basis for making our judgments about purity and cleanliness of heart. Christ has to be the standard. What does he teach? What did he practice? So Christ should be our standard. Christ should also be the one that we focus on, that we look to for help, that we depend upon day by day, knowing that we are weak in ourselves and vulnerable to temptation. So Christ should be our morning focus, our focus at night, and then as we go through the day to be in prayer, to be thinking of Christ, because he is the only defense against the spotting and the filthiness of the world. And then we're going to fall and sin sometimes. We're going to give way. And we need the purification of Christ as our advocate, who we go to in confession and pleading for his mercy and asking that he would wash us and clean us and set us aright, that when Satan accuses us, that he can't keep us down by constantly reminding us of our past sin, but living a clean life knowing that Christ forgives our sins and cleanses us from all unrighteousness. We need to look to him. Well, true religion, I trust that you have continually evaluated yourself, and you will evaluate what kind of religious commitment do you have to God. How is it lived out? May you think about it carefully. May you guard your tongue as an expression of your religious commitment to God. May you help those in need without necessarily expecting some payment and response, and may you keep yourself unspotted from the sins of the world. Well, thanks for joining us on our live stream. I trust that you will keep studying God's Word and growing in it. And the Lord will bless you with a very happy New Year's Eve and day, but more importantly, a spiritually rich and growing 2021. May the Lord bless you. Thanks for joining us.